I thought my greatest humiliation was discovering my husband in bed with my golden child sister. I was wrong. The true betrayal was watching them walk into court, alongside my own parents, to deliver a perfectly rehearsed lie under oath. For 2 years, they all believed they had successfully broken me. Then, a forged refinancing document appeared on my desk. I am not going to cry or beg. I am reopening the case to destroy them with the truth. My name is Piper Holmes. If you want to understand how a person learns to erase themselves, you only need to walk through the hallway of my childhood home in the manicured suburbs of Charlotte. The walls are a curated museum of Savannah Holmes. Savannah in her high school cheerleading uniform. Savannah holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Savannah laughing with her head thrown back in that practiced, effortless way that made everyone in the room gravitate toward her. I am in some of those pictures, usually standing slightly to the left, wearing a tight smile, blending seamlessly into the wallpaper. Savannah was the golden child. She was beautiful, effortlessly talkative, and possessed a frightening ability to charm her way out of any consequence. She knew how to flatter people, how to make them feel like they were the center of her universe for exactly as long as she needed them to be. In our house, she was always forgiven before she even had the chance to form an apology. If she crashed my father's car, it was because she was overwhelmed by the pressures of being so popular. If she dropped out of her university program for the third time, my mother would sigh lovingly and tell their friends that Savannah was simply a free spirit, taking time to find herself. I, on the other hand, figured out early on that the only way to survive was to require absolutely nothing from them. I chose the cold, undeniable safety of reality. I studied late into the night. I secured full academic scholarships. I learned that while love and attention were finite resources hoarded by my sister, mathematics and logic were impartial. I stepped into the world of contract risk management, a field where emotions were liabilities and facts were currency. By the time I reached my late 20s, I was a senior director at Caldwell Meridian Procurement Group. It was a monolithic supply chain consulting firm with a brutal reputation for discipline and protecting corporate money. My job was to look at a contract involving hundreds of millions of dollars, find the hidden traps, calculate the exact percentage of risk, and neutralize it. I was very, very good at it. When you spend your whole life navigating the unpredictable emotional minefield of a family that does not see you, predicting corporate risk feels like breathing. For years, my accomplishments were met with polite, distracted nods at the dinner table. A promotion that came with a six-figure salary was acknowledged with a brief comment from my father, usually followed swiftly by a pivot back to whatever minor drama Savannah was currently starring in. I told myself I did not care. I built a fortress of spreadsheets, routines, and quiet evenings in my immaculate, empty apartment. Then, I met Julian Mercer. We met at a local art fundraiser, the kind of event I only attended out of corporate obligation. I was standing by a rather uninspired abstract sculpture, mentally calculating the tax write-off the host was claiming, when Julian walked up and offered me a glass of sparkling water. He was a boutique interior designer, and unlike the aggressive, loud men I dealt with in the corporate world, Julian was gentle. He had a refined, quiet taste and an unhurried way of speaking. But more than anything, he knew how to listen. He looked at me as if I was the only person in the crowded room. When I spoke, he did not interrupt. He did not ask me to smile more or tell me I was being too serious. For a woman who had spent her entire existence carrying the weight of her own life without a single safety net, Julian felt like a revelation. He made me feel, for the very first time, that I could lean back and someone would actually catch me. My family had always labeled me as unapproachable, cold, and difficult to love. Julian told me he loved my stillness. He said my calmness anchored him. He had a moderate amount of ambition, preferring to focus on the artistry of his work rather than the aggressive expansion of a business, and I found that lack of greed endearing. We were married on a crisp afternoon in October. It was a small ceremony. Shortly after the wedding, I made a decision that felt, at the time, like the ultimate act of partnership. I took a significant portion of my personal savings, along with a part of my inheritance, and handed it over to Julian to help him open his own independent design studio. I transferred tens of thousands of dollars without a second thought. I reviewed his business plan, adjusted his profit margins, and signed the lease for his commercial space. I believed with every fiber of my being that we were building a life together, a fair and balanced existence that was entirely mine. It was the antithesis of the chaotic, unequal dynamic I had endured in my childhood home. I was investing in my husband, and by extension, investing in our sanctuary. That sanctuary was further solidified when my grandmother passed away. She was the only person in my family who had ever looked past Savannah's dazzling light to see me standing in the shadows. When the will was read, my parents were shocked to learn that she had left her coastal cottage at Bracken Point entirely to me. It was not a grand mansion, just a weathered, two-bedroom cedar-shingled house, sitting quietly 30 feet from the high tide line. But to me, it was a kingdom. Bracken Point was the only place in my childhood where I felt chosen. It was the only place where I was loved purely for existing, without having to compete in the exhausting, unwinnable pageant against my sister. Owning it felt like holding a tangible piece of proof that I mattered. Strangely, around the time Julian's studio began to gain traction, and the deed to Bracken Point was securely in my name, my parents suddenly began taking an active interest in my marriage. At first, I foolishly let myself believe they were finally making an effort to understand me. I thought they were finally proud of the life I had built. I was wrong. They were not interested in me at all. They were interested in Julian. Julian, it turned out, possessed a specific kind of social fluency that my parents absolutely adored. He knew exactly when to show up with a bottle of my father's favorite wine. He knew exactly what compliments to feed my mother about her garden. He was charming, presentable, and impeccably dressed. He was the perfect, shiny son-in-law they could parade around at their country club dinners and neighborhood barbecues. He effortlessly slipped into the exact social space they valued most, the space of appearances. I watched him charm them, and instead of feeling wary, I felt a profound sense of relief. For years, I had been the difficult daughter, the one who ruined the aesthetic of their perfect family by being too serious, too rigid. Now Julian was bridging the gap. He was doing the emotional heavy lifting I was incapable of. When we left my parents' house after Sunday dinners, I would lean my head against the passenger window of the car, watching the streetlights blur by, feeling a deep, quiet peace settle in my chest. I looked at my husband, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel, and I looked at the life we had arranged so carefully. I had a demanding but lucrative career, a beautiful marriage, a cottage by the sea, and a husband who somehow made my family tolerate me. I truly believed I had finally escaped the old, toxic order of the Holmes family. I had built a fortress where I was the priority. I went to sleep every night wrapped in the comforting illusion of safety, completely unaware that I had not escaped my family's treacherous dynamic at all. I had simply invited it into my own home, handing over the keys to a much more dangerous version of the very thing I had spent my entire life running from. The intrusion began on a damp Tuesday evening in late October. I was sitting on the living room sofa, reading a quarterly risk report, when the doorbell chimed at 9 o'clock. I opened the door to find Savannah standing on my porch, flanked by two massive designer suitcases. Her mascara was slightly smudged, a calculated imperfection meant to evoke sympathy. She had broken up with her wealthy boyfriend, lost her access to his downtown penthouse, and had nowhere else to go. She offered me a pitiful, familiar smile, wearing an expression that suggested the universe had once again treated her unfairly, and it was my designated role to provide the compensation. Every instinct in my body screamed against letting her step over the threshold. My house was my strictly controlled environment, a place where boundaries were respected and chaos was denied entry. I knew that having my sister occupy my guest room would mean surrendering the peace I had painstakingly built. To preserve my sanity, I offered an alternative. I suggested she take the keys to the Bracken Point cottage for a few weeks to clear her head. It was a perfectly reasonable compromise. I expected Julian to agree with my practical solution. Instead, His eyes brightened with a sudden, enthusiastic energy. He immediately volunteered to drive her to the coast and help her settle in. He argued that the cottage needed a professional assessment anyway. He proposed a plan to standardize the interior, fix the peeling paint, and upgrade the fixtures so we could eventually list it as a premium short-term rental by the following summer. It sounded like a brilliant financial strategy. It sounded like a husband taking the initiative to manage family assets. At that exact time, the universe decided to test my capacity for stress. Caldwell Meridian launched a massive internal audit for one of our largest pharmaceutical clients. I was thrust into the center of a chaotic financial investigation that required me to commute constantly between our Charlotte headquarters and a regional office in Richmond. I was driving 3 hours each way, living on stale hotel coffee, and working 14-hour days. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained, leaving Julian and Savannah with vast, unsupervised stretches of time at the coast under the convenient guise of managing family property. The subtle shifts in my reality did not announce themselves with loud alarms. They seeped in quietly, like water finding the cracks in a foundation. I noticed Savannah started using a new nickname for my husband. She dropped the formal Julian and began calling him Jewel, letting the single syllable roll off her tongue with an ease that felt uncomfortably intimate. I started noticing her social media posts. She would upload vague, dreamlike photos to her feed. A picture of 2 pairs of bare feet resting on the coastal sand. A blurred image of 2 coffee mugs on a sunlit wooden railing. She never tagged the location. She never mentioned who she was with. When I called Julian late one night from my hotel room in Richmond and asked him about the posts, he offered a low, dismissive chuckle. He told me I was letting the corporate stress get to my head, that I was overthinking completely innocent moments. He made me feel entirely irrational, painting my growing unease as baseless jealousy. When I did manage to make it back to Charlotte for the weekends, our dinners felt entirely foreign. I felt like a stranger awkwardly interrupting a private dinner party in my own dining room. Savannah would casually reach into the pantry and pull out the exact obscure oak-aged Chardonnay that Julian loved, pouring it before he even had to ask. Julian would uncap a bottle of Pinot Noir, perfectly remembering that Savannah despised anything with a fruity finish. They shared inside jokes about the local hardware store clerk at the beach, or the strange neighbor with the loud dog. I was always the person walking into the middle of a story that had begun hours before I arrived. The boundaries in my home evaporated. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen to find Savannah casually wearing Julian's oversized navy blue cashmere sweater. She had not asked to borrow it. She simply walked into our bedroom, opened his closet, and took it. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking coffee, acting as if his sister-in-law swimming in his clothing was the most natural thing in the world. Later that same day, I asked Julian to hand me his phone so I could check the weather forecast for my drive back to Richmond. When I tapped the screen, a prompt for a new 6-digit numerical passcode appeared. He snatched the device from my hand quickly. He claimed he had just signed a high-profile design client, and the non-disclosure agreements required him to lock down all his personal devices. But I am a woman who builds her life on data. I manage risk. I look for the anomalies that other people ignore. I opened my laptop and logged into our joint checking account. Amidst the usual grocery store charges and gas station receipts, I spotted the bleeds. They were small, seemingly insignificant transfers. $400 on a Monday, $650 on a Thursday, $800 2 weeks later. The money was being routed to a coastal contractor Savannah had supposedly recommended for the cottage renovations. When I confronted Julian about the outgoing funds, he smoothed his shirt and calmly explained it was just the standard cost for drywall patching and painting the guest bathroom. I decided I needed to see the fresh paint for myself. It was a Thursday afternoon in late November. The Richmond audit wrapped up a day early, and instead of driving back to Charlotte, I pointed my car toward the coast. I did not send a text message. I did not call. I wanted the element of surprise. When I pulled into the gravel driveway at Bracken Point, the house was devastatingly quiet. The faint sound of the ocean breeze rustled through the cedar trees. I walked around the side of the house toward the back deck that overlooked the water. I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting on the small teak table were two half-empty glasses of expensive red wine. Draped carelessly over the back of the wicker chair was a white cotton robe. It was not a hotel towel. It was my personal robe, the one with my initials meticulously embroidered on the breast pocket. Just as my brain registered the violation of seeing my intimate clothing discarded on the deck, the glass sliding door creaked open. Julian and Savannah stepped out onto the porch together for a fraction of a second before their social masks snapped firmly into place. I saw it. It was a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Their eyes widened, their breathing hitched, and a silent, frantic conversation passed between them in an instant. It was the look of two people who had just been caught standing over a dead body. A lesser woman might have screamed. A more emotional wife might have shattered those wine glasses against the wooden deck and demanded answers. But the chaotic environment of my childhood had trained me to suppress explosions. I knew that losing my temper would only give them the power to call me hysterical. So, I forced my facial muscles to relax. I smiled a tight, polite smile. I told them my meetings finished early and I just wanted to check on the progress of the renovations. I stayed for exactly 1 hour. I drank a glass of water, nodded at the new paint in the bathroom, and then told them I was exhausted and needed to drive back to the city to sleep. I walked to my car with a steady, measured pace. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I drove away. As the miles of highway rolled out ahead of me, the betrayed wife sitting in the driver's seat quietly stepped aside, and the senior director of risk management took the wheel. I realized that my vague feminine intuition was no longer sufficient. If I was going to navigate this betrayal, I needed empirical evidence. I began an entirely new project. I opened a hidden, encrypted folder on my secured work computer. I started silently logging the exact time of every phone call, every unexplained absence, every social media post. I downloaded bank statements and categorized every single dollar transferred out of our accounts. I matched the contractor payments against Julian's daily mileage logs. I was not building a case for a marriage counselor. I was building a dossier. The revelation did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a lipstick stain on a collar. It arrived at exactly 11:45 on a Tuesday night, illuminated by the harsh, artificial glow of our kitchen appliance. I had come downstairs for a glass of water while Julian slept soundly on the second floor. As I stood by the refrigerator, the smart display embedded in the door suddenly flickered. It was connected to an old, discarded tablet of his that we kept in a kitchen drawer for recipes, a device he had clearly forgotten to unlink from his primary cloud account. A notification popped up indicating a new photo album had finished syncing. The screensaver shifted. I found myself staring at a high-resolution image of my sister sitting straddled across my husband's lap, on the pristine white sand directly behind the Bracken Point property. They were laughing. It was not the awkward, stolen laughter of two people making a drunken mistake. It was the deeply settled, comfortable joy of a couple who had absolutely nothing left to hide from each other. A normal person would have dropped their glass. A normal wife would have marched upstairs, turned on the bedroom lights, and screamed until her vocal cords tore. I did neither. The temperature in my veins simply dropped to absolute zero. The rigid discipline that made me exceptional at my job took total command of my nervous system. I set my glass down quietly. I walked into his home office, sat at his desktop computer, and went to work. I knew the core architecture of his digital life. He had recently changed his phone passcode, but human beings are fundamentally lazy. They rarely change their root recovery passwords. Within 20 minutes, I had bypassed his secondary email authentication and gained full access to his master cloud drive. What I found over the next 4 hours was not just a record of infidelity, it was a forensic trail of a hostile takeover. I pulled his hidden credit card statements, matching them against his file-sharing application history and the digital calendars he thought were private. I mapped out a timeline of hotel stays, afternoon rendezvous, and shared dinners that stretched back a full 8 months. They had been sleeping together long before Savannah ever showed up on my porch with her suitcases. Her entire breakup story had been manufactured to gain geographical proximity to Julian, but the physical betrayal was merely the surface layer. The true horror lay buried in their exported text message archives. I opened a document containing thousands of lines of dialogue between them. They were not just whispering sweet nothings, they were wargaming my divorce. They knew that if I caught them, I would immediately sever all ties and protect my assets. To counter that, they needed to preemptively construct a narrative that would neutralize my financial advantage. They were actively strategizing how to tell the right story in a court of law. The plan was remarkably cruel. They intended to paint me as an obsessively controlling, financially abusive partner who weaponized money to keep her husband entirely isolated. They wanted to argue that my demanding corporate schedule and my strict budgeting had driven Julian to the brink of a nervous breakdown, justifying his need for substantial spousal support and, most importantly, a massive equity buyout of the coastal cottage. I kept scrolling, my eyes burning from the screen glare, until I found a message from Savannah sent 3 weeks prior. It read, "The court system always believes a crying family over a stack of spreadsheets. When the time comes, Mom will weep on the witness stand, Dad will confirm whatever she says, and Piper will just sit there with that blank, emotionless face of hers. She will not shed a tear, and she will make herself look guilty without us having to do a thing." She was banking on the very coping mechanism I had developed to survive our childhood. She planned to use my stoicism as the final nail in my coffin. I dug deeper into the shared folders. My breathing grew shallow when I opened a file labeled Financial Outlines. Julian had photographed and uploaded the private documents detailing my inheritance from my grandmother. He had documented my independent investment portfolios, my retirement accounts, and my restricted stock units from Caldwell Meridian. He had even written down a list of my behavioral triggers, essentially creating a tactical manual for Savannah on how I reacted when placed under extreme psychological pressure. He had handed my own sister the exact blueprints to my destruction. Beneath the financial documents was a brief exchange that finally made my stomach turn. Savannah had sent a picture of the ocean view from my deck. Julian had replied that the view was perfect. Savannah typed back, "Bracken Point is so much prettier when it is legally owned by the right person. Someone who actually knows how to enjoy it instead of just treating it like a line item on a tax return." They were turning the only safe harbor of my childhood, the only place I had ever felt genuinely loved by my grandmother, into a sick inside joke. It was a commodity waiting to be split, a prize they were eagerly anticipating. The clock on the wall read 4 in the morning. I had everything I needed. I plugged in 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I downloaded the entire cloud directory. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the text conversations. I used a specialized software program from my work laptop to extract and preserve the metadata of every single image and document, proving exactly when and where they were created. I routed a final backup to a secure, off-site server that only I had the credentials to access. When the sun began to rise at 6:30, I closed the computer. I walked into the kitchen, made a pot of black coffee, and poured 2 mugs. I sat at the kitchen island and waited. At 7:15, I heard his footsteps on the stairs. He walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, wearing the very cashmere sweater his mistress had paraded around in weeks ago. He smiled sleepily and reached for his coffee. I slid a thick, bound stack of printed paper across the polished marble island. It stopped exactly 1 inch from his hand. The top page was the photo of Savannah sitting in his lap. He looked down. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. The charming, relaxed facade he had worn for the entirety of our marriage shattered into a million pieces. For a span of perhaps 10 seconds, he tried to formulate a lie. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sheer volume of the evidence sitting in front of him made denial impossible. When he realized he was trapped, he did exactly what the text messages predicted he would do. He stopped acting like a husband who had made a mistake and instantly transformed into a victim. He pushed the papers away, his expression hardening into something cold and resentful. He leaned across the counter, looking me dead in the eye, and delivered the line he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the dark with my sister. You do not know how to love anyone. Piper, he said, his voice dripping with venom. You only know how to control them. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared back at him, registering the precise moment the war officially began. He had no idea that I had already read the script. That exact sentence, that calculated accusation of control, would soon become the central pillar of the grand lie they would tell in the courtroom. But right then, in the quiet of my kitchen, it was just the confirmation that my husband was entirely dead to me. I filed the divorce petition exactly 48 hours after sliding that binder of evidence across the kitchen island. I walked into the county courthouse with a naive, almost childish belief in the mechanics of justice. I assumed that because I held the absolute truth, I would not be treated like the perpetrator. I assumed the legal system was a sterile environment designed to process facts, weigh evidence, and spit out an equitable result. Julian counterattacked with a speed and ferocity that completely took my breath away. Before my attorney could even schedule a preliminary hearing, his legal team filed an aggressive motion for temporary financial support. The narrative they spun in those legal filings was a masterpiece of fiction. Julian claimed he had systematically sacrificed his own earning potential and the growth of his design studio to accommodate my grueling corporate travel schedule. He painted himself as the neglected, emotionally starved spouse who was driven to the brink of a severe mental breakdown by my relentless, suffocating demands. Then came Savannah. She did not shrink into the shadows as the shameful mistress whose affair had just been exposed. Instead, she rebranded herself with terrifying efficiency. She transformed into the reluctant, grieving sister. She told anyone who would listen, our mutual friends, the neighbors, even the court-appointed mediator, that she had only stepped in because she could no longer stand by and watch her younger sister mentally destroy a fundamentally good man. She weaponized her natural charisma, wearing conservative, muted clothing and a tragic, pained expression. It was a hypocritical display so thoroughly convincing that I watched outsiders, people who had known me for over a decade, begin to waver and avert their eyes when I walked past them in the lobby. The true slaughter, however, occurred inside the courtroom during the evidentiary hearing. It was a damp Tuesday morning. The air conditioning was turned up far too high, leaving a permanent, biting chill in the room. When the bailiff called my parents to the witness stand, a cold, heavy stone dropped into the bottom of my stomach. I sat frozen, watching my own flesh and blood raise their right hands and swear under penalty of perjury to tell the whole truth. My mother testified first. She gripped the edges of the wooden witness box, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated sorrow. She testified that I had always been alarmingly cold, inherently disconnected from human emotion, and obsessively strict with finances. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue while recounting entirely fabricated stories of me forcing Julian to beg for basic grocery money. My father followed immediately after, his jaw set in a grim line of faux paternal disappointment. He looked directly at the judge and stated, on the official public record, that my husband was terrified to speak the truth in his own home. He testified that Julian lived in a constant state of walking on eggshells, suffocated by my absolute financial dictatorship. I sat at the petitioner's table, my fingernails digging deep half-moons into the palms of my hands. I was watching my parents retroactively rewrite my entire personality under oath, actively sacrificing me to protect the golden child who was currently sitting 3 rows back, performing the role of the heartbroken spectator. Julian's attorney then introduced their physical exhibits. They submitted a document labeled as a psychological counseling note from an out-of-network therapist Julian claimed to have seen privately for trauma. The document described him as exhibiting classic symptoms of severe emotional abuse. Then, they entered an audio file into evidence. The courtroom fell dead silent as the speakers crackled to life. My own voice filled the large room, sounding sharp, shrill, and unhinged. I heard myself shout that every single dime in this house is controlled by me, and you will not spend another cent without my strict authorization. I felt all the blood rush out of my head. It was my voice, but the audio was horribly, violently manipulated. It was a spliced recording taken from a highly technical, heated argument we had 9 months prior regarding his commercial studio lease, where I had discovered a hidden tax liability he was trying to ignore. I had been talking about his corporate business account, not our home life, but stripped of all original context, edited for maximum impact, and played in that echoing courtroom. It sounded like the manifesto of a domestic tyrant. When it was my turn to take the stand, my attorney asked me to clarify the recording and the financial allocations. I did what I have always done in moments of extreme, unmanageable crisis. I detached. I compartmentalized the screaming agony of my family's betrayal and leaned heavily on the cold, hard architecture of facts. I answered the questions with steady, measured precision. I cited exact dates, precise account balances, and specific contract clauses. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. It was the most catastrophic mistake I could have possibly made. My composure, my articulate responses, my reliance on documented evidence, the very traits that made me exceptional at risk management, were instantly weaponized against me. Julian's lawyer tore into me during cross-examination, using my calm demeanor as the ultimate, undeniable proof of their narrative. He pointed at me and asked the judge how any woman whose marriage was violently dissolving could sit there without showing a single shred of human grief. I was not seen as a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will to survive an ambush. I was seen as the cold, calculating, emotionless machine my family had just sworn I was. The judge was a seasoned man nearing retirement. I could tell from his initial line of questioning that he did not entirely buy Julian's helpless victim routine. There were glaring holes in my husband's timeline and inconsistencies in his financial disclosures. But a judge is still a human being. And this judge was overwhelmingly swayed by the unified, devastating testimony of my biological family. The fact that my own parents had taken the stand to condemn me shifted the entire axis of the trial. The case slipped entirely out of the realm of empirical fact and plunged deep into the murky, unpredictable waters of emotional bias. The final ruling was delivered 2 weeks later, and the words printed on the official decree made me physically sick. The judge ordered me to pay a substantial sum in spousal support every single month for a duration of 3 years, but the ultimate blow, the true theft that broke me, involved my grandmother's coastal property. Because Julian had purchased the paint, the drywall, and the new bathroom fixtures using our joint checking account during that convenient renovation project, the court ruled that the capital improvements had legally commingled the asset. The judge declared that a significant percentage of the cottage's newly appraised value was now marital property. I was legally forced to buy out my cheating husband's fabricated share of Bracken Point, handing over a massive sum of money just to keep the only place that had ever felt like home. The courtroom slowly emptied after the gavel fell. I remained seated at the heavy wooden table, the air completely knocked out of my lungs, staring blankly at the polished wood grain. I was mechanically packing my legal pads into my leather briefcase when I finally looked up. Julian and Savannah were standing near the heavy double doors at the back of the room. They did not touch, but they did not have to. Savannah caught his eye, and a microscopic, triumphant smirk touched the corner of her mouth. It was a look of absolute, untouchable victory. I walked out into the echoing marble hallway. My parents were waiting near the elevator bank. My mother would not meet my eyes, staring intently at the floor tiles, but my father stepped directly into my path. He did not look apologetic. He did not look like a man who had just destroyed his youngest daughter. He looked annoyed, as if I had just inconvenienced him by losing the very trial he had helped rig against me. He adjusted his tie, let out a heavy, exhausted sigh, and delivered the phrase that had defined the entirety of my existence. "Just leave it be, Piper," he said, his voice flat and commanding. "Pay the settlement. Do not embarrass the family any further." They stepped into the elevator, the metal doors sliding shut, leaving me standing entirely alone in the freezing hallway. I had been stripped of my finances, my sanctuary, and my sanity, forced to bear the full, crushing weight of a punishment I did not earn. On the first day of every single month for the past 2 years, I sat at my pristine glass desk, logged into my secure banking portal, and authorized a transfer of a substantial sum of money into an account owned by the man who had destroyed my life. It was court-ordered spousal support. Every keystroke felt like forcing my hand through a storm of broken glass. I was systematically funding the romantic, sun-drenched coastal life of my ex-husband and my sister, using the very wealth I had spent my entire youth fiercely protecting. They did not hide. In fact, they flaunted their victory with a sickening, carefully curated aesthetic. Julian and Savannah had taken the equity they extracted from me and officially launched their joint business venture. They used Bracken Point as the foundational backdrop for their new boutique lifestyle brand, a hybrid interior design and wellness retreat model. They rebranded the cottage, stripping away the weathered cedar shingles and the quiet memories of my grandmother, replacing them with stark white paint and imported linen. Savannah became the face of the operation. She frequently posted glossy, soft-focus articles online about the importance of finding peace and healing after escaping a highly toxic, financially abusive marriage. She positioned Julian as the resilient survivor and herself as the angelic savior who had rescued him from my clutches. It was a masterclass in psychological projection, broadcasted to thousands of local followers. I did not leave angry comments. I did not engage. I simply excised the cancer from my life. I changed my phone number, blocked every single email address associated with my parents and my sister, and sold the marital home in Charlotte to an anonymous corporate buyer. I packed away only what I strictly needed and purchased a modern townhouse in a high-security gated community. It was a sterile architectural cube of glass, steel, and matte black finishes. Nothing was out of place. There were no messy guest rooms, no unlocked doors, and absolutely zero space for uninvited guests. My environment was entirely under my jurisdiction. No one was allowed to cross my threshold without explicit, scheduled permission. My professional life, fueled by the cold, compacted fury of my divorce, accelerated at a terrifying pace. The executives at Caldwell Meridian recognized that I had returned from my personal leave stripped of any remaining tolerance for human error or manipulation. Within 18 months, I was promoted to Vice President of Supplier Integrity. I was no longer just managing standard contract risks. I was the apex predator they unleashed on massive corporate fraud cases involving tens of millions of dollars. When a logistics vendor tried to bury a kickback scheme deep within a 200-page invoice, I found it. When a foreign supplier attempted to forge compliance certificates, I systematically dismantled their entire corporate structure and handed the remains over to federal regulators. I operated with a frightening surgical detachment. My colleagues whispered that I was ruthless, that I possessed a chilling lack of empathy for the executives I investigated. They were entirely correct. To the outside world, I was the absolute picture of a woman who had successfully bounced back. I wore tailored designer suits, drove a spotless luxury sedan, and commanded a department that handled billions of dollars in global supply chain assets. I looked like a textbook success story. But internally, the pain had not evaporated. It had simply been reorganized. I learned how to pack the suffocating betrayal into mental boxes, slap a barcode on them, and shove them into the darkest corners of my mind. I only opened those boxes when I needed fuel, when I needed to remember exactly why I could never afford to trust another human being again. Naturally, there were attempts at dating. Well-meaning colleagues would set me up with wealthy, successful men. I went on dates with investment bankers and corporate lawyers, men who wore expensive watches and ordered the right vintage of wine. The dinners were perfectly pleasant, but they never progressed past a second meeting. It was not that I had forgotten how to love, or that I was incapable of feeling attraction. It was that the moment a man leaned across the table and tried to ask me a personal question, an invisible steel wall slammed down between us. I could not sit across from anyone without a relentless, cynical voice echoing in my head. I looked at their smiles and only saw potential liabilities. I could not tolerate the vulnerability of letting someone into my life who could not provide a verified, sworn affidavit answering one simple question: what is it that you actually want to extract from me? I was fully prepared to live the rest of my life in this heavily fortified state of isolation. But exactly 24 months after the judge had legally sanctioned my robbery, the past found its way through my defenses. It arrived in the form of a casual email from an old friend who lived near the coast and had largely stayed out of the fallout of my divorce. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single web link to a digital magazine that focused on coastal real estate and high-end design. I clicked the link. The page loaded a beautifully formatted feature article praising Julian and Savannah. The headline celebrated them as a visionary creative couple who had miraculously transformed a decaying family property into a stunning story of rebirth and entrepreneurial success. There were high-resolution photographs of them standing on the back deck of Bracken Point, holding hands, looking out at the ocean. I forced my eyes to scan the text, reading the glowing interview where Savannah described their journey. Then, I hit the fourth paragraph, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. The journalist asked them how they managed to launch such an ambitious project so quickly. Julian, quoted directly in the article, happily explained that they had actually drafted the entire business plan and secured the initial design permits for the retreat model a full 10 months before they officially opened their doors. He noted that the specific vision for the commercial property had been their shared dream since the very beginning of their relationship. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. 10 months prior to their opening meant they were actively planning the commercialization of Bracken Point during the exact period we were separated. Months before our divorce was even finalized. It meant the quiet, domestic renovations Julian claimed he was doing just to fix up the guest bathroom were, in fact, the first phase of a premeditated commercial enterprise. During the trial, Julian had sworn under oath that he had no intention of running a business out of the cottage. He had testified that the renovations were purely for basic upkeep, and that the idea to start a retreat with Savannah had only blossomed organically long after the divorce was settled. He had used that specific narrative to convince the judge that the property's increase in value was standard marital appreciation, not a commercial asset he was trying to hide and divide to his advantage. The timeline in this glossy, boastful magazine article directly contradicted his sworn testimony. It was a casual, arrogant slip of the tongue to a local reporter, but to a woman who spent her life hunting discrepancies in supply chain data, it was a glaring, neon sign of perjury. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I did not immediately call my lawyer. I sat perfectly still in the quiet of my townhouse, letting the sheer magnitude of their stupidity wash over me. I moved my mouse, hit the print command, and listened to the steady hum of my laser printer spitting out the 6 pages of the article. I walked over to my filing cabinet, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out the heavy sealed folder containing my divorce documents. I carefully clipped the freshly printed magazine article to the very front of the court decree. It is a fascinating paradox. I had the high-powered career, the perfect credit score, the immaculate home, and the total independence. By every measurable metric, I had recovered, yet, looking at that single piece of paper, featuring a single, arrogant quote with a miscalculated timeline, I realized the absolute truth. You can sweep the broken glass under the rug, you can buy new furniture, and you can change the locks on the doors. But until the people who burned your house down are forced to stand in the ashes, the wreckage is never truly cleared. The case, in my mind, was never closed. It was simply waiting for a vulnerability in their system, and they had just handed me the key. My cell phone vibrated across the polished surface of my desk at exactly 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed a number I had deliberately scrubbed from my contacts exactly 24 months ago. It was my father. For a fraction of a second, a phantom echo of the old, obedient daughter flickered in my chest, wondering if someone had died. I silenced the thought and answered the call. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing after 2 years of total estrangement. His voice came through the speaker tight, impatient, and laced with a strange, evasive urgency. He told me there was a minor clerical error regarding the old property separation, and he needed me to urgently digitally sign a supplementary release form just to tie up some lingering loose ends. He spoke fast, trying to bulldoze over my silence with the sheer velocity of his words, adopting the exact tone he used whenever he wanted to bypass my boundaries and get his way. I leaned back in my leather office chair. I told him I would not sign a single pixel until I had the complete, unredacted file sitting in my inbox. He sighed loudly, muttering something about me always making things unnecessarily difficult, but he eventually agreed. 10 minutes later, a heavy digital document arrived in my secure email. It was not a simple release form. It was a massive, complex commercial refinancing package tied directly to the Bracken Point cottage. Julian and Savannah were apparently attempting to pull hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity out of the property to fund a second location for their wellness retreat. I scrolled past the amortization schedules and the bank disclosures until I reached the final execution page. There, sitting starkly against the white background, was an electronic signature bearing my full legal name, alongside a digital notary stamp dated exactly 4 months prior. I stared at the screen, my eyes locking onto the precise timestamp generated by the platform. It read October 14th at 9:30 in the morning. A cold, electric thrill shot straight up my spine. I opened my encrypted corporate calendar and cross-referenced the date. On the morning of October 14th, I was standing in a locked, high-security ballroom at a luxury hotel in Denver, delivering a keynote presentation at Caldwell Meridian's annual Executive Risk Summit. I had been on a heavily monitored stage for 2 straight hours. I had corporate badge swipes, internal emails, and security camera footage verifying my exact physical location. More importantly, I had a room full of 50 senior supply chain executives who could swear under oath that I did not have a mobile device or a laptop anywhere near my hands at 9:30 in the morning. That signature was a blatant, verifiable forgery. The anger that washed over me in that moment was completely different from the agonizing, suffocating heartbreak of discovering my husband's infidelity. This was not the messy, tear-soaked pain of a betrayed wife. This was a spectacularly clean, icy rage. It was the absolute fury of a professional auditor, realizing she was still being actively used as a living rubber stamp for an ongoing, multi-level financial scam. They had not just stolen my past. They were currently attempting to mortgage my identity to finance their future. I did not call my old divorce attorney. That man had been outmaneuvered by a crying mother and a fake audio clip. I needed a predator. I made 3 phone calls to my corporate legal contacts and secured an immediate meeting with Nora Ellison. Nora was a senior partner at a boutique civil litigation firm, a woman renowned for her ruthless precision in dismantling document fraud and corporate embezzlement. When I walked into her downtown office, she did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a cup of warm tea. She pointed to the empty chair across from her heavy oak desk and waited for me to speak. I unpacked my leather briefcase. I laid out the entire history of the betrayal, stripped of all emotional narrative. I presented the original court decree, the bank statements, the contradictory magazine article boasting about their timeline, and finally, the newly minted refinancing package with my forged digital signature. Nora leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the documents with the speed of a machine. She tapped her gold pen against the forged signature page. "Sleeping with your sister does not give you the legal grounds to reopen a settled divorce case," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "The court does not care about broken hearts. But forging a signature on a federally backed financial instrument, actively concealing commercial business revenue during a marital asset split, and committing organized perjury on the witness stand? That is a completely different game. That will blow the doors entirely off the hinges." She then reached for the file containing the evidence Julian had used during the first trial. She pulled out the psychological counseling note, the one that claimed I was a financially abusive tyrant. Nora stared at the single sheet of paper for a very long time. She tilted her head, inspecting the margins and the phrasing. She slid the paper back toward me. She pointed out that there were no diagnostic billing codes anywhere on the document. The formatting did not align with any standard electronic medical record system currently used in the state. The language used to describe his supposed trauma was melodramatic and highly unscientific. It did not look like a legitimate clinical assessment written by a licensed healthcare provider. It looked exactly like what a panicked interior designer and his girlfriend imagined a clinical assessment should look like. My professional instincts, honed by years of tearing apart corrupt global supply chains, completely took over. I stopped looking at Julian, Savannah, and my parents as a family unit that had failed me. I began looking at them as a hostile, fraudulent vendor network. I needed to map the entire conspiracy. I asked myself the exact questions I used during corporate audits. Who had the primary motive? Who walked away with the financial benefit? Which specific pieces of data had been artificially altered to support their narrative? And most critically, which link in their chain was weak enough to pull the entire structure down to the ground? The electronic signature was the fatal flaw. They had grown entirely too arrogant. They assumed that because I had walked away quietly 2 years ago, I would simply remain a docile, terrified victim forever. They assumed I would never bother to read a document my father pressured me to sign. They had vastly underestimated the woman they had created. I sat in Nora's office as the afternoon sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. I made the final, irrevocable decision. I was not going to reopen this case to seek an apology. I was not doing it to avenge a dead marriage. I was doing it because if I did not strike back with absolute, overwhelming force, they would continue to mine my identity and my assets for the rest of my natural life. They had treated me like a disposable commodity. Now, I was going to show them exactly what happens when a commodity decides to audit the people who stole it. Nora did not waste a single second. She retained a private digital forensics expert, a man who treated computer hard drives and cloud servers like active crime scenes. He did not care about the emotional drama of a shattered family. He only cared about the absolute, undeniable truth hidden within the code. His initial target was the psychological counseling note Julian had paraded around the courtroom 2 years ago, when the expert tore into the digital footprint of the file. The entire illusion dissolved instantly. The document had never originated from any medical clinic, hospital, or licensed therapist's office. The extracted metadata revealed that the file was authored on a personal laptop. The registered device name matched my sister's primary email handle almost perfectly. Savannah had literally sat down at her keyboard, opened a blank word processing document, and typed out a completely fictional clinical diagnosis of my marriage. She had formatted it to look just official enough to fool a judge who was already heavily leaning toward her tearful performance. Next, the forensic expert turned his attention to the audio recording. That specific clip had been the final nail in my coffin during the first trial. The piece of evidence that painted me as a shrieking, unhinged financial tyrant. The expert fed the audio file through a high-level spectral analysis program. The visual readout of the sound waves exposed the violent, artificial splices immediately. He mapped out exactly where the file had been cut and stitched together. It was not one single, terrifying outburst. It was a composite track meticulously created from 3 entirely distinct, separate conversations we had experienced over a period of several months. Those original conversations had been highly technical arguments regarding his studio's commercial lease and hidden tax liabilities. They had systematically deleted every single sentence where I referenced business risk, vendor contracts, or corporate tax law. They surgically extracted only the isolated fragments of my voice sounding intensely frustrated, binding them together to create a completely fabricated, out-of-context narrative of domestic abuse. While the tech expert dismantled their physical evidence, Nora unleashed a barrage of targeted bank subpoenas. The resulting financial disclosures peeled back the pristine, victimized layer of Julian's sworn testimony. During the exact months he claimed to be utterly broke, starving for resources, and emotionally crippled by my financial control, he had actually been running an incredibly lucrative off-the-books operation. The banking records showed a steady, concealed stream of revenue flowing into an undisclosed secondary account. He was taking massive cash payments for side design contracts and quietly renting out the coastal cottage through a third-party vacation platform well before our marriage was legally dissolved. He had intentionally starved our joint accounts while hoarding this secret income, deliberately presenting a fraudulent, poverty-stricken financial portrait to the court in order to secure maximum spousal support from my paycheck. The technical data was entirely bulletproof, but the human element is what truly exposed the deep rot at the center of my family. I received an unexpected phone call from Tess Delgado, an old friend from my university days who had slowly drifted away during the messy fallout of my divorce. We met at a quiet coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Tess looked completely exhausted, gripping her ceramic mug with white knuckles. She finally looked me in the eye and confessed a secret that had been eating away at her conscience for 24 months. 2 weeks before the original trial, my mother had called her. My mother did not ask Tess to tell the truth. Instead, she gently suggested that Tess might want to search her memory for any instances where I had lost my temper. My mother had specifically asked Tess to fabricate a memory, to swear under oath that I was mentally unstable, all to ensure Julian would not get swallowed whole by the legal system. Tess had refused to testify, but the realization that my own mother had actively tried to recruit false witnesses to destroy my credibility solidified the absolute moral bankruptcy of my blood relatives. The puzzle pieces were accelerating now, snapping into place with a lethal, satisfying precision. Using my corporate audit instincts, I helped Nora track down the primary structural contractor who had executed the initial remodeling at the Bracken Point property. We did not even need to press him hard. He was a practical businessman who kept meticulous, organized records. He handed over a thick stack of dated email exchanges and architectural blueprints. The time-stamped headers on those emails proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Julian and Savannah had been actively corresponding with him, drafting the specific layout for their commercial wellness retreat, a full 6 months before my divorce was finalized. They had not organically started their brilliant, healing business venture after everything fell apart, as they had tearfully sworn on the witness stand. They had been actively building their new commercial empire while they were still living in my house, utilizing my marital assets to fund their foundation. The final, fatal blow in our investigation was the forged electronic signature on the recent refinancing package. The digital platform's security logs were remarkably transparent when hit with a federal subpoena. The two-factor authentication code required to finalize that signature had never been sent to my personal cell phone. The records showed it had been routed to a cheap, prepaid mobile device purchased with untraceable cash. However, the criminals had made one catastrophic, arrogant mistake. They had completed the digital signing process using a localized wireless internet connection. The subpoenaed internet protocol address attached to that final, fraudulent click did not bounce off some anonymous coffee shop router. It traced directly back to the private network installed inside Julian's former design studio. Nora sat across from me in her office, organizing the mountain of evidence into a single, devastating legal motion. She looked at me with a sharp, dangerous smile. I realized then that I was fully in control. We were not filing a grievance about a broken heart, a cheating husband, or a stolen childhood. The backbone of our motion was purely structural and utterly ruthless. We were alleging a highly coordinated, multi-party conspiracy to commit fraud upon the court. The adultery was just the surface layer, the inciting incident. The true, actionable crimes were perjury, the manufacturing of fraudulent medical documents, the intentional concealment of commercial revenue, and the explicit forgery of a financial instrument. Nora crafted the language to be sterile, precise, and lethal. I understood the enormous risk we were taking. Because of the specific nature of the filing, the motion would almost certainly land right back on the desk of the exact same judge who had presided over the original trial. Nora warned me that judges are fundamentally protective of the integrity of their own courtrooms. Presenting this massive cache of evidence meant forcing a proud, seasoned judge to look at the official record and admit that he had been spectacularly, humiliatingly played by a crying mother and a smooth-talking interior designer. Absolutely no judge likes being proven a fool. There was a very real chance his wounded ego could make him hostile to our claims, pushing him to bury the issue just to save face. But it was a calculated risk I was entirely willing to take. I was betting that his professional outrage at being manipulated would ultimately override his personal embarrassment. The motion was officially filed with the court clerk at exactly 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Nora hit the send button, electronically serving the massive document package to Julian's current legal counsel. We did not issue a polite warning. We did not send a courtesy email. We dropped a tactical weapon directly onto their carefully curated, sun-drenched coastal lives right before the weekend began. I left Nora's office, walked to my car, and sat in the driver's seat. For the first 30 minutes, there was nothing but absolute perfect silence in the cabin. Then, as the sun began to dip and the evening traffic swelled around me, my cell phone ignited. It started with a single text message, then a missed call, then another. Within the span of 2 hours, my notification screen transformed into a chaotic waterfall of panicked, furious alerts. There were aggressive, demanding voicemails from my father, hysterical missed calls from my mother, and a barrage of incredibly hostile, thinly veiled threats sent from Savannah's number. I did not open a single message. I did not answer a single call. I simply sat in the quiet dark of my vehicle and watched the screen light up over and over again. Their absolute, unhinged panic was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. It was the flawless, undeniable confirmation that I had finally struck the exact nerve they had been terrified I would find. They realized, all at once, that the obedient, quiet sister they thought they had permanently buried was now standing right behind them, holding the shovel. The weekend immediately following the filing of our legal motion was a masterclass in human panic. By Saturday morning, the invisible dam holding back my family's anxiety completely collapsed. My mother was the very first to break through my carefully constructed communication barriers. She bypassed my blocked caller list by dialing from a landline number I did not recognize. When I let it roll to voicemail, she left an audio message lasting exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It was a symphony of forced, theatrical tears. She did not utter a single syllable of apology for perjuring herself on a witness stand. She did not express a single ounce of remorse for actively participating in the theft of my grandmother's property. Instead, she aggressively accused me of exhuming the past. She wept into the receiver, claiming I was ruthlessly digging up dead bodies just to push our fragile family over the edge of a cliff all over again. She demanded to know why I could not just let people heal. I sat at my kitchen counter, transcribed her message word for word, noted the exact time of her call, and dropped the digital audio file directly into my encrypted evidence folder. Then came Julian. He bypassed the formal legal channels entirely, a move that showcased his sheer desperation, and sent a direct text message to my personal phone number late Sunday night. The carefully crafted facade of the traumatized, emotionally abused victim was completely gone. In its place was pure transactional panic. He typed out a long, rambling paragraph offering to discreetly wire me a lump sum of $75,000 within 48 hours if I would agree to immediately withdraw the civil motion. He promised we could handle the financial discrepancy quietly, without involving the judge. He was not trying to buy my forgiveness, nor was he attempting to make amends. He was trying to buy my silence because he finally understood that if this case proceeded to open court, he would lose not just a fraction of his stolen money, but his entire aesthetic empire, his public brand, and potentially his freedom. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the bribe and archived it. Savannah opted for psychological warfare. She sent a carefully worded email consisting of 3 short paragraphs early Tuesday morning. Her message was drenched in a sickening, faux sisterly concern. She casually mentioned her close, ongoing relationships with several local journalists who had previously written glowing profiles about their coastal wellness retreat. She wondered aloud, in a tone dripping with soft menace, if the local press might be interested in running an exclusive follow-up story detailing my severe mental instability following the devastating collapse of my marriage. She was attempting to resurrect the exact same phantom narrative she had successfully manufactured 2 years prior, banking on the assumption that the threat of public humiliation and professional embarrassment would force me to back down. I did not reply to a single one of them. I engaged in absolute, suffocating silence. I downloaded every email, took screenshots of every text, and saved every voicemail. Every tearful plea, every cowardly financial bribe, and every thinly veiled threat transformed into undeniable, documented proof of their consciousness of guilt. They were frantically building their own gallows, and I was simply collecting the wood. By Wednesday afternoon, the internal pressure within the Holmes family had reached a critical mass, causing their unified front to violently fracture. An unexpected email arrived in my inbox from my mother's youngest sister, a maternal aunt who had quietly relocated to the West Coast over a decade ago specifically to escape my parents' toxic, narcissistic orbit. The timestamp on the email was 2:15 in the morning. She attached a series of 6 images. They were pristine screenshots taken from a private family group chat dated exactly 3 weeks prior to my original divorce trial. The messages captured a highly tactical brainstorming session between my parents and my sister. My father had explicitly typed a message stating that if they could paint a convincing picture of Julian being physically terrified of my explosive temper, the presiding judge would undoubtedly tilt the financial scales in his favor. Savannah had replied to his strategy with a simple thumbs-up emoji. It was written, "Irrefutable documentation of a conspiracy to commit perjury." Meanwhile, Nora was systematically executing the structural legal groundwork with terrifying efficiency. She obtained a sworn, notarized affidavit from the chief medical director of the psychology clinic that Julian had supposedly used for his trauma therapy. The director stated plainly and unequivocally that the specific letterhead design used on Julian's submitted counseling document had been officially retired and physically destroyed by their administrative office exactly 6 years ago. Furthermore, they conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of their electronic medical database and confirmed under penalty of perjury that neither Julian Mercer nor Piper Holmes had ever been registered as patients at their facility. The foundational brick of their emotional abuse narrative completely disintegrated into dust. Nora prepared our witness list over the course of 8 grueling hours in her downtown conference room. She treated the preparation like a surgeon laying out her scalpels. She called Tess Delgado and the coastal structural contractor into her office for intensive mock cross-examinations. She ruthlessly trained them to strip every single ounce of emotion from their voices. She strictly instructed them to give absolutely zero defensive explanations and to volunteer 0 extra words to the opposing counsel. They were taught to answer questions with devastating, surgical brevity. Yes, no, that is the correct date on the invoice. Those were her exact words on the telephone. Nora knew that Julian's lawyer would try to agitate them into making a mistake, and she ensured that every single calculated response they gave would strike precisely at the weakest structural points of the old, fabricated testimonies. That same evening, I had a scheduled dinner date with a man I had been seeing casually for about 3 months. He was a commercial architect, grounded, highly perceptive, and refreshingly straightforward. Normally, I would have kept our dinner conversations strictly focused on neutral, safe topics like international travel or modern architectural trends, firmly locking my personal chaos away in its designated mental box. But sitting across from him in the dimly lit restaurant, the heavy armor I had worn for 2 solid years suddenly felt suffocating. I put my silver fork down on the linen tablecloth, looked him directly in the eyes, and told him the entire story. I spoke for nearly 45 minutes. I did not soften the sharp edges of my humiliation. I did not ask for his pity or his validation. I simply laid out the profound betrayal, the devastating court loss, and the brutal, unforgiving legal war I was currently waging. I did it not to seek comfort, but to prove to myself that I was no longer operating under the miserable, exhausting mechanism of hiding my massive scars just to make other people feel comfortable around me. If he walked away from the table, I would survive it. But to my absolute surprise, he simply reached across the table, poured me another glass of red wine, and calmly asked if my legal representation was ruthless enough to finish the job properly. A restless electric energy pulled me completely out of the city the night before the evidentiary hearing. I drove my car down the dark, winding coastal highway for 2.5 hours until my tires crunched onto the familiar gravel driveway of Bracken Point. I parked the car and killed the engine. I did not walk onto the wooden porch. I walked directly past the newly painted white facade of their stolen retreat and stepped out onto the cold, damp sand. The ocean was a roaring, pitch-black void churning violently under the pale moonlight. I stood exactly where my grandmother used to sit with me, looking back at the weathered cedar cottage that had once been my absolute only safe harbor in a deeply unfair, chaotic world. The freezing salt air stung my cheeks. I stood there alone for a full hour, letting the harsh wind whip through my heavy wool coat. I made a quiet, unbreakable promise to myself in the dark. Tomorrow morning, I was not walking into that courtroom to reclaim my lost childhood or to win back a piece of real estate. The past was already dead, buried, and gone. I was walking into that federal building for one singular, absolute purpose: to permanently and violently sever their unearned power over my future. Walking back into the exact same county courthouse felt like stepping into a vacuum where the air had been entirely sucked out of the room. It was 8:30 in the morning on a crisp Tuesday. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, sealing us inside the very chamber where my life had been dismantled 24 months prior. Fate, or perhaps the darkly comedic scheduling system of the legal clerk's office, had assigned our motion directly back to the original presiding judge. The atmosphere was incredibly thick, vibrating with a specific, unspoken tension. Every single attorney present understood the stakes. We were not just challenging a financial settlement. We were implicitly telling a highly respected veteran judge that he had been spectacularly manipulated, blinded by crocodile tears, and used as a pawn in a fraudulent scheme. His honor and the integrity of his courtroom were laid bare on the polished wooden tables. Nora did not waste a single breath on pleasantries when the session commenced. She stood up, buttoned her tailored jacket, and delivered an opening statement so sharp it felt like a physical strike. Adultery broke my client's heart. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing clearly across the silent room. But infidelity did not strip her of her assets. A highly coordinated, meticulously executed campaign of organized fraud. We are not here to litigate broken vows. We are here to present undeniable proof of perjury, evidence tampering, and financial forgery committed right under the nose of this court. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening into a mask of severe scrutiny. He did not silence her. He gestured for her to call her first witness. Tess Delgado took the stand. She looked nervous but entirely resolute. Under Nora's precise questioning, Tess recounted the exact phone call she received from my mother 2 weeks prior to the original trial. She detailed how my mother had practically begged her to invent a memory of me acting violently, to help Julian secure a favorable judgment. I did not look at Tess while she spoke. I looked directly at the gallery benches behind the defense table. My parents were sitting there, completely rigid. The smug, untouchable confidence they had worn into the building instantly evaporated. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother stared at her lap, her face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. For the first time in my entire existence, the flawless facade of the Holmes family was being publicly dismantled under oath. Next, Nora called our digital forensics expert. He approached the witness box carrying a thick binder of technical readouts. He did not use confusing jargon. He broke the data down with the ruthless simplicity of a teacher explaining basic arithmetic to a child. He projected the metadata of the supposed psychological counseling note onto the large screen. He pointed to the author tag, which clearly displayed a username matching my sister's primary email handle. He then projected the visual sound wave of the audio recording that had previously condemned me. The screen lit up with bright red markers, indicating the exact timestamps where 3 distinct, separate business conversations had been violently sliced and stitched together to create a fake narrative of domestic abuse. He explained the manipulation so clearly that no one in the room, not even the most technologically illiterate observer, could pretend they did not understand exactly what had been done. The defense attorney tried to object, claiming the data could have been corrupted, but the judge sharply overruled him. The judge's eyes were locked onto the screen, his mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. Nora then called the chief administrative officer from the psychology clinic. The testimony lasted less than 5 minutes. The representative confirmed that the clinic possessed zero medical records for anyone named Julian Mercer. She looked at the counseling note entered into evidence and testified that the letterhead was a crude, amateur forgery using an old logo that the clinic had officially retired 6 years ago. The foundational pillar of Julian's emotional victimhood shattered into dust right there on the courtroom floor. But Nora was not finished. She was building to the true kill shot. She called the security compliance officer from the electronic signature platform to testify regarding the recently forged refinancing package. The officer explained the two-factor authentication process. He testified that the mandatory security code meant for me was actually routed to a prepaid, untraceable mobile device. Then, he delivered the definitive blow. He stated that the digital platform had recorded the Internet protocol address of the computer used to execute the final, fraudulent signature. The address belonged to the private wireless network installed inside Julian's commercial design studio. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. The dynamic of the trial violently shifted in that exact second. This was no longer a messy, emotional family dispute about who said what. This was a documented, technical felony. The ink on the forgery had an undeniable digital fingerprint tracing directly back to my ex-husband's desk. Julian was forced to take the stand just before the lunch recess. He looked physically ill. The golden boy charm, the soft, sensitive demeanor he had used to captivate my parents and sway the court 2 years ago, was entirely gone. His expensive suit looked too large for his frame. Nora circled him like a shark sensing blood in the water. She did not yell. She used the contractor's emails and the glossy magazine interview to box him into a corner. She methodically stripped away every possible exit route until he was forced to answer one simple, fatal question. Did you, or did you not, actively collaborate with Savannah Holmes to draft commercial blueprints for the Bracken Point property a full 6 months before your divorce from my client was legally finalized? Nora asked, her tone entirely devoid of emotion. Julian swallowed hard. He looked at his lawyer, who offered nothing but a grim, helpless stare. Yes, Julian whispered into the microphone. He had just confessed to committing perjury during the first trial. He had admitted to intentionally hiding a commercial business venture to steal my inheritance. Savannah, sitting in the gallery, was desperately trying to maintain her posture. She sat with her spine straight, her chin lifted, attempting to project the image of an innocent bystander caught in a legal crossfire. She held on to that mask until Nora approached the projector one final time. Nora displayed a high-resolution screenshot of a text message exchange extracted directly from Julian's recovered cloud backup. The letters were magnified, towering over the courtroom. The text, sent from Savannah to Julian, read, "As long as the judge believes Piper is unstable, Bracken Point is ours." The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. It was too direct. It was too exceptionally dirty. There was no possible way to spin it as a joke or a misunderstanding. It was the raw, unvarnished blueprint of their malice, laid out in plain text for the judge to read. I watched Savannah's flawless mask crack, fracture, and completely fall away. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to charm or manipulate. No rescue came. The judge struck his gavel with a loud, sharp crack that echoed off the high ceiling. His face was a portrait of cold, controlled fury. He announced a 2-hour recess before final arguments and the rendering of his decision. I walked out of the double doors into the wide marble hallway. I did not go to the cafeteria. I stood quietly near the large paneled windows at the far end of the corridor, watching the fallout. About 40 feet away, standing near the elevator bank, was my family. but they were no longer the unified, impenetrable alliance that had marched into this building 2 years ago to destroy me. They were standing in a jagged circle, their voices hushed but laced with venomous panic. Savannah was aggressively pointing her finger at Julian, her face contorted in anger, clearly trying to distance herself from the forged signature. Julian was shaking his head, throwing his hands up, visibly shoving the blame for the fraudulent therapy note back onto her. My father was rubbing his temples, looking between the two of them with absolute disgust, realizing his own social reputation was about to be dragged through the mud. My mother was crying again, but this time, the tears were completely real. They were not comforting each other. They were not plotting a new defense. They were four terrified people holding on to the edges of a sinking ship, actively looking for a way to throw each other overboard just to stay afloat for a few more minutes. I stood in the quiet sunlight streaming through the window, my pulse steady and calm, watching the Golden family finally devour itself. When the court was called back into session at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature in the room seemed to have dropped another 10 degrees. The judge did not sit back in his leather chair. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy oak bench, and stared directly at the defense table. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the measured, neutral tone of a mediator. It was the sharp, unyielding steel of a magistrate who had been made a fool of in his own courtroom. He stated for the official record that this proceeding was no longer a high-conflict divorce fueled by heavy emotions. He declared it a coordinated, multi-party campaign of intentional fraud. He noted that Julian and my family had weaponized their social standing and exploited the inherent trust of the judicial system to actively distort a financial settlement. Then, the hammer fell. The first ruling hit the defense table like a physical blow. The judge retroactively vacated the entire spousal support order. Every single future obligation was terminated immediately, effective the very second he struck his gavel. More importantly, he granted Nora's motion to allow me to legally pursue full financial reimbursement for every single dollar I had been forced to pay my ex-husband over the past 24 months under the fraudulent decree. He did not stop there. The judge systematically listed the concealed commercial revenue from the coastal cottage, the blatantly fabricated psychological documents, and the maliciously spliced audio recording. He stated unequivocally that these were not minor exaggerations, but material misrepresentations that had fundamentally corrupted the original judgment. Because of this, he possessed the absolute legal authority to reopen and drastically amend the previous asset division. Then came the electronic signature. The judge looked directly at Julian and Savannah, his eyes narrowing into a glare of pure judicial disgust. He announced that due to the overwhelming, uncontested digital evidence of a forged financial instrument, he was immediately referring the entire case file to the local district attorney and the state civil investigative division. He explicitly ordered criminal reviews for forgery, perjury, and felony obstruction of justice against my ex-husband, my sister, and any other individual who had actively assisted them in executing the scheme. Regarding the coastal property, the judge stripped them of their playground. He imposed an immediate, court-ordered mandatory accounting of every single penny of profit generated by the Bracken Point Wellness Retreat since its inception. To ensure they could not hide or liquidate the assets, he established a constructive trust over the property. Julian and Savannah were legally paralyzed, permanently blocked from extracting another dime of wealth from the cottage they had stolen through deceit. It was in that precise moment of total legal devastation that the final, glorious collapse of my family's mythology occurred. My father, who had sat in stunned silence for the entire afternoon, suddenly stood up from the gallery bench. He raised his hand, his voice shaking with a desperate, misplaced arrogance, and tried to interrupt the proceedings. He told the judge that they were just trying to protect their family, that things had gotten out of hand but their intentions were to shield their own flesh and blood. The judge did not even blink. He looked over his reading glasses at my father and delivered a sentence so flawlessly cold, it shattered the foundation of my entire childhood in a single heartbeat. Family, sir, is not a recognized legal exception for the crime of perjury, the judge snapped. Sit down and remain silent, or I will have the bailiff place you in holding for contempt." My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. He slowly sank back onto the wooden bench, the lifelong excuse he had used to justify every toxic, unfair dynamic in our household, completely destroyed in front of a gallery of strangers. When the proceedings officially concluded, I walked out into the marble corridor with Nora. The scene unfolding near the elevators was chaotic. Savannah was practically screaming at Julian, furiously jabbing her manicured finger at his chest, loudly blaming him for the forged signature and the fake therapy documents. Julian was shouting right back, his face flushed purple, insisting that every single strategic move, including the entire narrative about my supposed emotional abuse, had been Savannah's brilliant idea from the start. I watched the golden child desperately looking around for someone to step in, validate her tears, and clean up the catastrophic mess she had made. No one moved. My mother broke away from the argument and walked toward me. Her mascara was running down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she reached out to grab my forearm. She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes she had always used to force me back into line. She told me that despite everything the judge had said, we were still a family and we had to find a way to fix this together. I did not deliver a long, dramatic speech. I did not raise my voice or slap her hand away. I simply looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing but the profound, quiet clarity of a woman who had finally woken up. "No," I said, my voice steady and exceptionally calm. "You are not my family. You are just people who got entirely too comfortable using me." I turned my back on her and walked toward the exit, leaving her standing frozen in the middle of the courthouse hallway. In the months that followed, I did not throw a wild celebration. I did not pop expensive champagne or go on a reckless vacation. I operated with the same meticulous discipline that had saved my life. Once the constructive trust was settled, I forced a legal sale of my fully recovered equity in Bracken Point. I sold it at peak market value to a commercial developer, liquidating the memories and the timber into a massive, untouchable financial reserve. I took a portion of that capital and approached the executive board at Caldwell Meridian. I successfully pitched and launched a highly specialized, independent consulting branch dedicated entirely to detecting and prosecuting complex corporate contract fraud. The most exquisite revenge was not ruining them. It was taking the exact trauma they used to try and break me, weaponizing it, and turning it into an entirely new empire of professional power and wealth. It was a quiet Friday evening in late November. I was standing in my townhouse, holding a glass of sparkling water, when my personal cell phone illuminated on the kitchen island. The screen displayed an unknown local number. I knew exactly who it was. The criminal investigations were accelerating, the legal bills were mounting for them, and desperation was setting in. I stared at the glowing digits for exactly 5 seconds. I did not feel a spike of anxiety. I did not feel the old, familiar tug of obligation. I simply reached out, flipped the phone face down against the cool marble, and walked away. I opened the glass doors and stepped out onto my private balcony. The autumn wind was crisp, and the sprawling city lights of Charlotte stretched out before me, glittering like 1,000 scattered diamonds in the dark. I took a deep, unobstructed breath of the cold evening air. I realized then that the most valuable asset I had reclaimed in that courtroom was not the hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution, nor was it the coastal house. The ultimate victory was the absolute, undeniable right to exist in the world without ever having to carry the crushing weight of their expectations again. I was finally, entirely, and wonderfully alone. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts with the community. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, leave a like on the video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and empower even more listeners.